Greetings. This is video number 22 of the poem Savitri by Sri Aurobindo. I'm about to read Canto 7 of Book 7, The Discovery of the Cosmic Spirit and the Cosmic Consciousness. In the little hermitage in the forest's heart, in the sunlight and the moonlight and the dark, the daily human life went plodding on, even as before, with its small unchanging works, and its spare outward body of routine, and happy quiet of ascetic peace. The old beauty smiled of the terrestrial scene. She too was her old gracious self to men. The ancient mother clutched her child to her breast, pressing her close in her environing arms, as if earth ever the same could forever keep the living spirit and body in her clasp, as if death were not there, nor end, nor change. Accustomed only to read outward signs, none saw aught new in her, none divined her state. They saw a person where was only God's vast, a still being or a mighty nothingness. To all she was the same perfect Savitri, a greatness and a sweetness and a light poured out from her upon her little world. Life showed to all the same familiar face. Her acts followed the old unaltered round. She spoke the words that she was wont to speak, and did the things that she had always done. Her eyes looked out on earth's unchanging face. Around her soul's muteness all moved as of old. A vacant consciousness watched from within, empty of all but bare reality. There was no will behind the word and act, no thought formed in her brain to guide the speech. An impersonal emptiness walked and spoke in her, something perhaps unfelt, unseen, unknown, guarded the body for its future work, or nature moved in her old stream of force. Perhaps she bore, made conscious in her heart, the miraculous nihil, origin of our souls, and source and sum of the vast world's events, the womb and grave of thought, a cipher of God, a zero circle of being's totality. It used her speech and acted in her acts. It was beauty in her limbs, life in her breath. The original mystery wore her human face. Thus she was lost within to separate self. Her mortal ego perished in God's night. Only a body was left, the ego's shell, afloat mid drift and foam of the world sea, a sea of dream watched by a motionless sense in a figure of unreal reality. An impersonal foresight could already see. In the unthinking knowledge of the spirit, even now it seemed nigh done, inevitable. The individual die, the cosmos pass. These gone, the transcendental grew a myth, the Holy Ghost without the Father and Son, or a substratum of what once had been, being that never willed to bear a world, restored to its original loneliness, impassive, soul, silent, intangible. Yet all was not extinct in this deep loss. The being traveled not toward nothingness. There was some high surpassing secrecy, and when she sat alone with Satyavan, her moveless mind with his that stretched and strove, in the hush of the profound and intimate night, she turned to the face of a veiled voiceless truth, hid in the dumb recesses of the heart, or waiting behind the last peak climbed by thought. Unseen itself, it sees the struggling world, and prompts our quest, but cares not to be found. Out of that distant vast came a reply, Something unknown, unreached, inscrutable, sent down the message of its bodiless light, cast lightning flashes of a thought not ours, crossing the immobile silence of her mind. In its might of irresponsible sovereignty, it seized on speech to give those flamings shape, made beat the heart of wisdom in a word, and spoke immortal things through mortal lips. Or, listening to the sages of the woods, in question and in answer broke from her, high strange revealings impossible to men. Something or someone secret and remote took hold of her body for his mystic use. Her mouth was seized to channel ineffable truths. Knowledge unthinkable found an utterance. Astonished by a new enlightenment, invaded by a streak of the absolute, they marveled at her, for she seemed to know what they had only glimpsed at times afar. These thoughts were formed not in her listening brain. Her vacant heart was like a stringless harp. Impassive, the body claimed not its own voice, but let the luminous greatness through it pass. A dual power at being's occult poles still acted, nameless and invisible. Her divine emptiness was their instrument. Inconscient nature dealt with the world it had made, and using still the body's instruments, slipped through the conscious void she had become. The superconscious mystery through that void missioned its word to touch the thoughts of men. As yet this great impersonal speech was rare. But now the unmoving wide spiritual space in which her mind survived, tranquil and bare, admitted a traveler from the cosmic breadths. A thought came through draped as an outer voice. It called not for the witness of the mind. It spoke not to the hushed receiving heart. It came direct to the pure perception seat, an only center now of consciousness, if center could be where all seemed only space. No more shut in body's walls and gates, her being, a circle without circumference, already now surpassed all cosmic bounds, and more spread into infinity. This being was its own unbounded world, a world without form or feature or circumstance. It had no ground, no wall, no roof of thought, yet saw itself and looked on all around in a silence, motionless and illimitable. There was no person there, no centered mind, no seat of feeling on which beat events or objects wrought and shaped reactions stress. There was no motion in this inner world. All was a still and even infinity. In her the unseen, the unknown, waited his hour. But now she sat by sleeping Satyavan, awake within, and the enormous night surrounded her with the unknowables vast. A voice began to speak from her own heart that was not hers, yet mastered thought and sense. As it spoke, all changed within her and without. All was, all lived, she felt all being one. The world of unreality ceased to be. There was no more a universe built by mind, convicted as a structure or a sign. A spirit, a being, saw created things, and cast itself into unnumbered forms, and was what it saw and made. All now became an evidence of one stupendous truth, a truth in which negation had no place, a being and a living consciousness, a stark and absolute reality. There the unreal could not find a place. The sense of unreality was slain. There all was conscious, made of the infinite. All had a substance of eternity. Yet this was the same indecipherable. It seemed to cast from it universe like a dream, vanishing forever into an original void. But this was no more some vague, ubiquitous point, or a cipher of vastness in unreal naught. It was the same, but now no more seemed far to the living clasp of her recovered soul. It was herself, it was the self of all, it was the reality of existing things. It was the consciousness of all that lived and felt and saw. It was timelessness and time. It was the bliss of formlessness and form. It was all love and the one beloved arms. It was sight and thought in one all-seeing mind. It was joy of being on the peaks of God. She passed beyond time into eternity, slipped out of space and became the infinite. Her being rose into unreachable heights and found no end of its journey in the self. It plunged into the unfathomable deeps and found no end to the silent mystery that held all world within one lonely breast, yet harbored all creation's multitudes. She was all vastness and one measureless point. She was a height beyond heights, a depth beyond depths. She lived in the everlasting and was all that harbors death and bears the wheeling hours. All contraries were true in one huge spirit, surpassing measure, change, and circumstance. An individual, one with cosmic self, in the heart of the transcendence miracle, and the secret of world personality, was the Creator and the Lord of all. Mind was a single innumerable look upon himself and all that he became. Life was his drama and the vast a stage. The universe was his body, God its soul. All was one single immense reality, all its innumerable phenomenon. Her spirit saw the world as living God. It saw the one and knew that all was he. She knew him as the Absolute's self-space, one with herself and ground of all things here, in which the world wanders seeking for the truth, guarded behind its face of ignorance. She followed him through the march of endless time. All nature's happenings were events in her. The heartbeats of the cosmos were her own. All beings thought and felt and moved in her. She inhabited the vastness of the world. Its distances were her nature's boundaries, its closenesses her own life's intimacies. Her mind became familiar with its mind. Its body was her body's larger frame, in which she lived and knew herself in it one, multitudinous in its multitudes. She was a single being, yet all things. The world was her spirit's wide circumference. The thoughts of others were her intimates, the feelings close to her universal heart, their bodies her many bodies kin to her. She was no more herself, but all the world. Out of the infinitudes all came to her. Into the infinitudes sentient she spread. Infinity was her own natural home. Nowhere she dwelt, her spirit was everywhere. The distant constellations wheeled round her. Earth saw her born, all worlds were her colonies. The greater worlds of life and mind were hers. All nature reproduced her in its lines. Its movements were large copies of her own. She was the single self of all these selves. She was in them and they were all in her. This first was an immense identity in which her own identity was lost. What seemed herself was an image of the whole, WHOLE. She was a subconscient life of tree and flower, the outbreak of the honeyed buds of spring. She burned in the passion and splendor of the rose. She was the red heart of the passion flower, the dream white of the lotus in its pool. Out of subconscient life she climbed to mind. She was thought and the passion of the world's heart. She was the Godhead hid in the heart of man. She was the climbing of his soul to God. The cosmos flowered in her. She was its bed. She was time and the dreams of God in time. She was space and the wideness of his days. From this she rose where time and space were not. The superconscient was her native air. Infinity was her movement's natural space. Eternity looked out from her on time. That is the end of Canto 7 of Book 7 and the end of Book 7. This is Book 8, the Book of Death, and this one canto is the whole book. It's called Death in the Forest. It could possibly be triggering to someone with severe PTSD, so just a warning. Now it was here in this great golden dawn. By her still sleeping husband lain she gazed into her past as one about to die looks back upon the sunlit fields of life, where he too ran and sported with the rest, lifting his head above the huge dark stream, into whose depths he must forever plunge. All she had been and done she lived again. The whole year in a swift and eddying race of memories swept through her and fled away into the irrecoverable past. Then silently she rose and, service done, bowed down to the great goddess simply carved by Satyavan upon a forest stone. What prayer she breathed her soul and Durga knew. Perhaps she felt in the dim forest huge the infinite mother watching over her child. Perhaps the shrouded voice spoke some still word. At last she came to the pale mother queen. She spoke, but with guarded lips and tranquil face, lest some stray word or some betraying look should let pass into the mother's unknowing breast, slaying all happiness and need to live, a dire foreknowledge of the grief to come. Only the needed utterance, passage found. All else she pressed back into her anguished heart, and forced upon her speech an outward peace. 1 year that I have lived with Satyavan, here on the emerald edge of the vast woods, in the iron ring of the enormous peaks, under the blue rifts of the forest sky. I have not gone into the silences of this great woodland that enringed my thoughts with mystery, nor in its green miracles wandered, but this small clearing was my world. Now has a strong desire seized all my heart, to go with Satyavan holding his hand into the life that he has loved, and touch herbs he has trod, and know the forest flowers, and hear at ease the birds and the scurrying life that starts and ceases, rich far rustle of boughs, and all the mystic whisperings of the woods. Release me now and let my heart have rest. She answered, do as thy wise mind desires, O calm child sovereign with the eyes that rule. I hold for thee a strong goddess who has come, pitying our barren days. So dost thou serve even as a slave might, yet art thou beyond all that thou doest. All our minds conceive, like the strong sun that serves earth from above. Then the doomed husband and the woman who knew went with linked hands into the solemn world, where beauty and grandeur and unspoken dream where nature's mystic silence could be felt, communing with the secrecy of God. Beside her, Satyavan walked full of joy because she moved with him through his green haunts. He showed her all the forest riches, flowers innumerable of every odor and hue, and soft, thick, clinging creepers, red and green, and strange, rich-plumaged birds. To every cry that haunted sweetly distant boughs replied, with the shrill singer's name, more sweetly called. He spoke of all the things he loved. They were his boyhood's comrades and his playfellows, co-evolves and companions of his life, here in this world whose every mood he knew. Their thoughts, which to the common mind are blank, he shared. To every wild emotion felt an answer. Deeply she listened, but to hear the voice that soon would cease from tender words, and treasure its sweet cadences beloved for lonely memory, where none by her walked, and the beloved voice could speak no more. But little dwelt her mind upon their sense. Of death, not life, she thought, or life's lone end. Love in her bosom hurt with the jagged edges of anguish, moaned at every step with pain, crying, now perhaps his voice will cease forever. Even by some vague touch oppressed, sometimes her eyes looked round as if their orbs might see the dim and dreadful gods approach. But Satyavan had paused. He meant to finish his labor here, that happy linked, uncaring, they too might wander free in the green deep, primeval mystery of the forest's heart. A tree that raised its tranquil head to heaven, luxuriating in verdure, summoning the breeze with amorous wideness of its boughs, he chose, and with his steel assailed the arm brown, rough and strong, hidden in its emerald dress. Wordless but near she watched, no turn to lose, of the bright face and body which she loved. His life was now in seconds, not in hours. Her life was now in seconds, not in hours, and every moment she economized, like a pale merchant leaning above his store, the miser of his poor remaining gold. But Satyavan wielded a joyous axe. He sang high snatches of a sage's chant that paled of conquered death and demon slain, and sometimes paused to cry to her sweet speech of love and mockery tenderer than love. She, like a pantheress, leaped upon his words and carried them into her cavern heart. But as he worked, his doom upon him came. The violent and hungry hounds of pain traveled through his body, biting as they passed silently, and all his suffering breath besieged, strove to rend life's strong heart cords and be free. Then helped, as if a beast had left its prey, a moment in a wave of rich relief, reborn to strength and happy ease he stood, rejoicing, and resumed his confident toil, but with less seeing strokes. Now the great woodsman hewed at him, and his labor ceased. Lifting his arm, he flung away the poignant axe, far from him like an instrument of pain. She came to him in silent anguish and clasped, and he cried to her, Savitri. A pang cleaves through my head and breast as if the axe were piercing it and not the living branch. Such agony rends me as the tree must feel when it is sundered and must lose its life. Awhile let me lay my head upon thy lap, and guard me with thy hands from evil fate. Perhaps because thou touchest, death may pass. Then Savitri sat under branches wide, cool, green against the sun, not the hurt tree, which his keen axe had cloven, that she shunned, but leaned beneath a fortunate kingly trunk. She guarded him in her bosom and strove to soothe his anguished brow and body with her hands. All grief and fear were dead within her now, and a great calm had fallen. The wish to lessen his suffering, the impulse that opposes pain, were the one mortal feeling left. It passed. Griefless and strong, she waited like the gods, but now his sweet familiar hue was changed into a tarnished grayness, and his eyes dimmed over, forsaken of the clear light she loved. Only the dull and physical mind was left, vacant of the bright spirit's luminous gaze. But once before it faded wholly back, he cried out in a clinging last despair, "Savitri, Savitri, oh Savitri, lean down my soul and kiss me while I die." And even as her pallid lips pressed his failed, losing last sweetness of response. His cheek pressed down her golden arm. She sought his mouth still with her living mouth, as if she could persuade his soul back with her kiss. Then grew aware they were no more alone. Something had come there, conscious, vast, and dire. Near her she felt a silent shade immense, chilling the noon with darkness for its back. An awful hush had fallen upon the place. There was no cry of birds, no voice of beasts. A terror and an anguish filled the world, as if annihilation's mystery had taken a sensible form. A cosmic mind looked out on all from formidable eyes, contemning all with its unbearable gaze, and with immortal lids and a vast brow, it saw in its immense destroying thought all things and beings as a pitiful dream. Rejecting with calm disdain nature's delight, the wordless meaning of its deep regard, voicing the unreality of things, and life that would be forever but never was, and its brief and vain recurrence without cease, and as if from a silence without form or name, the shadow of a remote uncaring God, doomed to his naught the illusory universe, cancelling its show of idea and act in time, and its imitation of eternity. She knew that visible death was standing there, and Satyavan had passed from her embrace. That is the end of Book 8, and the end of Part 2 of the poem Savitri by Sri Aurobindo. Next is Part 3, Books 9 through 12. Book 9, The Book of Eternal Night, possibly triggering. Canto 1 of Book 9, Towards the Black Void. So was she left alone in the huge wood, surrounded by a dim, unthinking world, her husband's corpse on her forsaken breast, and her vast silent spirit motionless. She measured not her loss with helpless thoughts, nor rent with tears the marble seals of pain. She rose not yet to face the dreadful God. Over the body she loved, her soul leaned out, in a great stillness without stir or voice, as if her mind had died with Satyavan, but still the human heart in her beat on. Aware still of his being near to hers, closely she clasped to her the mute lifeless form, as though to guard the oneness they had been, and keep the spirit still within its frame. Then suddenly there came on her the change which in tremendous moments of our lives can overtake sometimes the human soul and hold it up towards its luminous source. The veil is torn, the thinker is no more, only the spirit sees and all is known. Then a calm power seated above our brows is seen, unshaken by our thoughts and deeds. Its stillness bears the voices of the world. Immobile, it moves nature, looks on life. It shapes immutably its far-seen ends, untouched and tranquil amid error and tears, and measureless above our striving wills. Its gaze controls the turbulent whirl of things. To mate with the glory it sees, the spirit grows. The voice of life is tuned to infinite sounds. The moments on great wings of lightning come, and godlike thoughts surprise the mind of earth. Into the soul's splendor and intensity, a crescent of miraculous birth is tossed, whose horn of mystery floats in a bright void. As into a heaven of strength and silence, thought is ravished, all this living mortal clay is seized, and in a swift and fiery flood of touches, shaped by a harmonist unseen, a new sight comes. New voices in us form a body of the music of the gods. Immortal yearnings without name leap down. Large quiverings of Godhead seeking run and weave upon a puissant field of calm, a high and lonely ecstasy of will. This in a moment's depths was born in her. Now to the limitless gaze disclosed, that sees things barred from human thinking's earthly lids, the spirit who had hidden in nature soared out of his luminous nest within the worlds. Like a vast fire it climbed the skies of night. Thus were the cords of self-oblivion torn. Like one who looks up to far heights she saw, ancient and strong as on a windless summit, above her where she had worked in her lone mind, laboring apart in a soul tower of self, the source of all which she had seemed or wrought, a power projected into cosmic space, a slow embodiment of the aeonic will, a starry fragment of the eternal truth, the passionate instrument of an unmoved power. A presence was there that filled the listening world. A central all assumed her boundless life. A sovereignty, a silence and a swiftness. One brooded over abysses. Who was she? As if a choric robe of unheard sounds, a force descended, trailing endless lights, linking time's seconds to infinity. Illimitably it girt the earth and her. It sank into her soul and she was changed. Then like a thought fulfilled by some great word, that mightiness assumed a symbol form. Her being's spaces quivered with its touch. It covered her as with immortal wings. On its lips the curve of the unuttered truth, a halo of wisdom's lightnings for its crown. It entered the mystic lotus in her head, a thousand-petaled home of power and light. Immortal leader of her mortality, doer of her works and fountain of her words, invulnerable by time, omnipotent, it stood above her, calm, immobile, mute. All in her mated with that mighty hour, as if the last remnant had been slain by death of the humanity that once was hers, assuming a spiritual wide control, making life see a mirror of heaven's sky, the young divinity in her earthly limbs, filled with celestial strength, her mortal part. Over was the haunted pain, the rending fear. Her grief had passed away, her mind was still. Her heart beat quietly with a sovereign force. There came a freedom from the heartstrings' clutch. Now all her acts sprang from a Godhead's calm. Calmly she laid upon the forest soil the dead who still reposed upon her breast, and bore to turn away from the dead form. Soul now she rose to meet the dreadful God. That mightier spirit turned its mastering gaze on life and things, inheritor of a work left to it unfinished from her halting past. When yet the mind, a passionate learner, toiled, and ill-shaped instruments were crudely moved. Transcended now was the poor human rule. A sovereign power was there, a godlike will. A moment yet she lingered motionless, and looked down on the dead man at her feet. Then like a tree recovering from a wind, she raised her noble head. Fronting her gaze, something stood there, unearthly, somber, grand, a limitless denial of all being, that wore the terror and wonder of a shape. In its appalling eyes the tenebrous form bore the deep pity of destroying gods. A sorrowful irony curved the dreadful lips that speak the word of doom. Eternal night in the dire beauty of an immortal face, pitying arose, receiving all that lives, forever into its fathomless heart, refuge of creatures from their anguish and world pain. His shape was nothingness made real, his limbs were monuments of transience, and beneath brows of unwearying calm, large godlike lids silent beheld the writhing serpent, life. Unmoved, their timeless, wide, unchanging gaze had seen the unprofitable cycles pass, survived the passing of unnumbered stars, and sheltered still the immutable orbs. The two opposed each other with their eyes, woman and universal God. Around her, piling their void, unbearable loneliness upon her mighty, uncompanioned soul, many inhuman solitudes came close. Vacant eternities forbidding hope laid upon their huge and lifeless look, and to her ears, silencing earthly sounds, a sad and formidable voice arose, which seemed the whole adverse worlds. Unclasp, it cried, thy passionate influence and relax, O slave of nature, changing tool of changeless law, who vainly writhest rebellion to my yoke, thy elemental grasp, weep and forget. Entomb thy passion in its living grave. Leave now the once loved spirit's abandoned robe. Pass lonely back to thy vain life on earth. It ceased, she moved not, and it spoke again, lowering its mighty key to human chords, yet a dread cry behind the uttered sounds, echoing all sadness and immortal scorn, moaned like a hunger of far-wandering waves. Wilt thou forever keep thy passionate hold, thyself a creature doomed like him to pass, denying his soul death's calm and silent rest? Relax thy grasp. This body is earth's and thine. His spirit now belongs to a greater power. Woman, thy husband suffers. Savitri drew back from her heart's force that clasped his body still, where from her lap renounced on the smooth grass softly it lay, as often before in sleep, when from their couch she rose in the white dawn, called by her daily tasks. Now too, as if called, she rose and stood, gathered in lonely strength, like one who drops his mantle for a race, and waits the signal, motionlessly swift. She knew not to what course, her spirit above, on the crypt summit of her secret form, like one left sentinel on a mountain crest, a fiery-footed splendor puissant-winged, watching, flaming silent, with her voiceless soul, like a still sail upon a windless sea. White passionless it rode, an anchored might, waiting what far-ridged impulse should arise out of the eternal depths and cast its surge. Then death, the king, leaned boundless down, as leans night over tired lands when evening pales and fading gleams break down the horizon's walls, nor yet the dusk grows mystic with the moon. The dim and awful Godhead rose erect from his brief stooping to his touch on earth, and, like a dream that wakes out of a dream, forsaking the poor mold of that dead clay, another luminous Satyavan arose, starting upright from the recumbent earth, as if someone over viewless borders stepped, emerging on the edge of unseen worlds. In the earth's day the silent marvel stood between the mortal woman and the god. Such seemed he as if one departed came, wearing the light of a celestial shape, splendidly alien to the mortal air. The mind sought things long loved, and fell back foiled from unfamiliar hues, beheld yet longed by the sweet radiant form unsatisfied, incredulous of its too bright hints of heaven, too strange the brilliant phantasm to life's clasp, desiring the warm creation of the earth, reared in the ardor of material suns. The senses seized in vain a glorious shade. Only the spirit knew the spirit still, and the heart divined the old loved heart, though changed. Between two realms he stood, not wavering, but fixed in quiet, strong expectancy, like one who, sightless, listens for a command. So were they immobile on that earthly field, powers not of earth, though one in human clay. On either side of one two spirits strove. Silence battled with silence, vast with vast. But now the impulse of the path was felt, moving from the silence that supports the stars to touch the confines of the visible world. Luminous he moved away. Behind him death went slowly with his noiseless tread. As seen in dream-built fields, the shadowy herdsman glides behind some wanderer from his voiceless herds. And Savitri moved behind eternal death. Her mortal pace was equaled with the gods. Wordless she traveled in her lover's steps, planting her human feet where his had trod, into the perilous silence beyond. At first in a blind stress of wood she moved, with strange inhuman paces on the soil, journeying as if upon an unseen road. Around her on the green and imaged earth, the flickering screen of forest ringed her steps. Its thick, luxurious obstacles of boughs besieged her body, pressing dimly through in a rich realm of whispers palpable. And all the murmurous beauty of the leaves rippled around her like an emerald robe. But more and more this grew an alien sound, and her old intimate body seemed to her a burden which her being remotely bore. Herself lived far in some uplifting scene, where to the trance-claimed vision of pursuit, soul presences in a high spaceless dream, the luminous spirit glided stilly on, and the great shadow traveled vague behind. Still with an amorous crowd of seeking hands, softly entreated by their old desires, her senses felt earth's close and gentle air cling around them, and in troubled branches new, uncertain treadings of a faint foot wind. She bore dim fragrances, far callings touched. The wild bird's voice and its winged rustle came, as if a sigh from some forgotten world. Earth stood aloof yet near. Round her it wove its sweetness and its greenness and delight, its brilliant swathe of well-loved vivid hues, sunlight arriving to its golden noon, and the blue heavens and the caressing soil. The ancient mother offered to her child her simple world of kind, familiar things. But now, as if the body's sensuous hold, curbing the godhead of her infinite walk, had freed those spirits to their grander road across some boundary's intangible bar, the silent God grew mighty and remote in other spaces, and the soul she loved lost its consenting nearness to her life. Into a deep and unfamiliar air, enormous, windless, without stir or sound, they seemed to enlarge away, drawn by some wide, pale distance from the warm control of earth and her grown far. Now they would escape. Then flaming from her body's nest alarmed, her violent spirit soared at Satyavan. Out mid the plunge of heaven-surrounded rocks, so in a terror and a wrath divine, from her eerie streams against the ascending death, indigent at its crouching point of steel, a fierce she-eagle threatened in her brood, borne on a rush of puissance and a cry, outwinging like a mass of golden fire. So on a spirit's flaming outrush borne, she crossed the borders of dividing sense, like pale discarded sheaths dropped dully down, her mortal members fell back from her soul. A moment of a secret body's sleep, her trance knew not of sun or earth or world. Thought, time, and death were absent from her grasp. She knew not self, forgotten was Savitri. All was the violent ocean of a will, where lived captive to an immense caress, possessed in a supreme identity, her aim, joy, origin, Satyavan alone. Her sovereign prisoned in her being's core, he beat there like a rhythmed heart. Herself but different still, one loved, enveloped, clasped, a treasure saved from the collapse of space. Around him, nameless, infinite, she surged, her spirit fulfilled in his spirit, rich with all time, as if love's deathless moment had been found, a pearl within eternity's white shell. Then out of the engulfing sea of trance, her mind rose drenched to light, streaming with hues of vision, and, awake once more to time, returned to shape the lineaments of things, and live in borders of the seen and known. Onward the three still moved in her soul scene, as if pacing through fragments of a dream, she seemed to travel on, a visioned shape, imagining other musers like herself, but them imagined in their lonely sleep. Ungrasped, unreal, yet familiar, old, like clefts of unsubstantial memory, scenes often traversed, never lived in, fled past her unheeding to forgotten goals. In voiceless regions they were travelers, alone in a new world where souls were not, but only living moods. A strange, hushed, weird country was round them, strange far skies above, a doubting space where dreaming objects lived within themselves, their once unchanged idea. Weird were the grasses, weird the treeless plains, weird ran the road which, like fear hastening towards that of which it has most terror, passed phantasmal between pillared conscious rocks, somber and high, gates brooding, whose stone thoughts lost their huge sense beyond, in giant night. Enigma of the inconscious sculptural sleep, symbols of the approach to darkness old, and monuments of her titanic reign, opening to depths like dumb appalling jaws that wait a traveler down a haunted path, attracted to a mystery that slays. They watched across her road, cruel and still. Sentinels they stood of dumb necessity, mute heads of vigilant and sullen gloom, carved muzzle of a dim enormous world. Then, to that chill, sere, heavy line, arrived where his feet touched the shadowy march's brink, turning, arrested, luminous Satyavan looked back with his wonderful eyes at Savitri. But death pealed forth his vast abysmal cry, O mortal, turn back to thy transient kind. Aspire not to accompany death to his home, as if thy breath could live where time must die. Think not thy mind-born passion strength from heaven to uplift thy spirit from its earthly base, and, breaking out from the material cage, to upbuoy thy feet of dream in groundless naught, and bear thee through the pathless infinite. Only in human limits man lives safe. Trust not the unreal lords of time, immortal, deeming this image of thyself, which they have built on a dream's floating ground. Let not the dreadful goddess move thy soul to enlarge thy vehement trespass into worlds where it shall perish like a helpless thought. Know the cold tombstones of thy hopes in life, armed vainly with the ideal's borrowed might, dare not to outstep man's bound and measured force. Ignorant and stumbling, in brief boundaries pent, he crowns himself the world's mock suzerain, tormenting nature with the works of mind. O sleeper, dreamer of divinity, wake trembling mid the indifferent silences in which thy few weak chords of being die. Impermanent creatures, sorrowful foam of time, your transient loves bind not the eternal gods. The dread voice ebbed in the consenting hush, which seemed to close upon it, wide, intense, a wordless sanction from the jaws of night. The woman answered not, her high, nude soul, stripped of the girdle of mortality, against fixed destiny and the grooves of law, stood up in its sheer will of primal force, still like a statue on its pedestal, lone in silence and to vastness bared, against midnight's dumb abyss piled in front, a columned shaft of fire and light, she rose. And that is the end of video number 22 of the poem Savitri by Sri Aurobindo. And this is the end of Canto 1 of Book 8.